A storm brews beneath the surface of Monroe, not in the skies, but in the silence that followed a single nod from an old man. No one shouted. No one ran. But everything shifted the moment that trunk opened and the officer realized who he had stopped wasn't just a man, but a mirror. Now, as the country watches, Monroe stands on trial not in court, but in the conscience of its own people. When the silence speaks louder than law, what happens next? Stay with us. Because what you're about to witness isn't just the end of a story, it's the beginning of something no uniform, no title, and no institution can ignore anymore. The morning wind always swept through the streets of Elmswood like it was impatient for the day to begin. It didn't blow hard, just purposeful, cutting through alleyways, nudging shutters, whispering along faded "Welcome to Elmswood" signs that no one had cared to repaint in a decade. The town moved at its own pace, slow and weary, like a man too proud to admit his knees had started to fail. Deputy Kyle Mercer sat behind the wheel of his cruiser, parked just off Highway 42, tapping his fingers in sync with a melody only he could hear. The radio was on but low, filling the vehicle with static and small talk from dispatch, none of it urgent. The roads were quiet, too quiet, if you asked him. In towns like Elmswood, quiet was never just peace. It was a silence waiting to be broken. He spotted it almost by accident, a matte black Lincoln gliding down the road, smooth and unbothered. It didn't dart. Didn't weave. It didn't even try to stand out. In fact, that was what stood out the most. No bumper stickers. No vanity plate. Just a government-issued tag with a bit of the paint chipped off near the corner. The windows were tinted just within regulation, but Kyle narrowed his eyes anyway. Something about it felt off. Not wrong. Not criminal. Just out of rhythm. He leaned forward, his instincts tightening like a string pulled taut. The Lincoln wasn't breaking any laws. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't swerving. But it moved with a deliberateness that Kyle couldn't ignore. Too slow. Too smooth. Too clean in a town that had long given up trying to polish its edges. He merged into the lane behind it, maintaining distance like a wolf shadowing its prey. The cruiser's lights remained off, but his hand hovered near the switch. Kyle didn't believe in coincidences. He believed in patterns. And this pattern, it didn't sit right. Through the windshield, he caught his first glimpse of the driver, an elderly black man, upright in posture, wearing a brown wool vest over a crisp white shirt, a gray felt hat tilted gently forward. His hands covered in sleek black leather gloves rested perfectly on the wheel at 10 and 2. He wasn't looking in the mirror. Wasn't scanning the road behind. Just staring ahead, steady as stone. Kyle's brow furrowed. Old guy, car like that, doesn't scream, retired judge, he muttered to himself. Screams borrowed. Or stolen. He flipped on the red and blue lights. The Lincoln pulled over immediately. No delay. No slow crawl like someone pretending to look for a safe spot. Just a single, precise maneuver toward the shoulder, and then a full stop. Kyle's boots thudded onto the road. His right hand instinctively rested near his holster. Not out of fear, just routine. He'd made hundreds of stops. Most went the way they were supposed to. Some didn't. But none ever began quite like this. The window rolled down. Slowly. Quietly. Not a creak. Not a sound. The man turned to look at him, not a full turn, just enough for their eyes to meet. His face was lined but composed. Not hostile. Not smiling. Calm. Almost unsettlingly calm. Kyle cleared his throat. Morning, sir. Do you know why I pulled you over today? The old man tilted his head a few degrees, his voice even and dry like a page from an old book. I imagine you have your reasons, he said. And I suppose I shouldn't guess what they are. Kyle's lips tightened. It wasn't defiance. But it wasn't submission either. It was neutral. And that was worse. Where are you headed? A farewell, the man replied, eyes fixed on the road ahead. Someone pass away? The pause was brief. Barely perceptible. A piece of history, the man said. That answer didn't make sense. It wasn't actionable. It wasn't evasive, either. Just, poetic in a way that made Kyle's skin itch. He stepped back to the cruiser and entered the plates. No flags. No priors. No outstanding anything. Not even a parking ticket. Too clean, Kyle thought. He returned and stood at the window again. License and registration, please. The man reached into his jacket and handed over a thin, worn leather wallet. Inside, nestled among perfectly aligned cards, was a government-issued ID Kyle had never seen before. The seal was faded silver, nearly transparent in the daylight. The card felt aged, not fake. Not new. Kyle studied it. Franklin Otis Hale, he read aloud. Is that your real name? He asked without looking up. It is, the man said calmly. If you doubt it, feel free to call it in. Kyle bristled slightly. He wanted a twitch. A stammer. Something to warrant the discomfort in his chest. But there was none. Just stillness. He called dispatch. Requesting verification for a Franklin Otis Hale. ID provided looks, unusual. A long pause. Can you repeat that name? The voice on the other end asked. Hale. Franklin Otis. The line went quiet again. Another voice returned. This one deeper. Measured. Are you requesting verification for the Honorable Franklin O. Hale, former Associate Justice of the State Supreme Court? Kyle swallowed. His throat was suddenly dry. I guess so, he said. There was no further reply. Just silence that weighed like lead. He stepped out of the cruiser again, more cautiously this time. He walked back to the Lincoln, his boots crunching louder now, though the ground hadn't changed. The old man still sat there, posture perfect, hands in place. Unmoving. Unbothered. Kyle leaned down, the ID still in his hand. You sure this is legit? He asked, the question sounding more like a dare than an inquiry. The man didn't blink. I gave you what I have, he replied. Whether you believe it is your prerogative. It wasn't the words. It was the delivery. Polite, but so neutral it was impossible to grasp. Kyle hated that. I'm going to need you to step out of the vehicle, he said. For what regulation? The man asked. State law permits officers to request a vehicle exit with reasonable suspicion. And what is your reasonable suspicion? Kyle hesitated. He had none. Not really. Just a feeling. Unusual behavior, he muttered. You think I'm behaving unusually because I didn't panic? Kyle flinched. I'm cooperating, the man continued, but I don't submit unless necessary. Every word the old man spoke was like a chisel to Kyle's control. Not sharp, not brutal but precise, and working on something Kyle hadn't realized was cracking. Still, he pushed forward. Open the trunk, he said. The old man turned to face him fully for the first time. His eyes didn't glint. Didn't harden. But they held something ancient. Something unshakable. I'll open it, he said. But if you find nothing, what then? Kyle clenched his jaw. The man unbuckled his belt, stepped out of the car. No sudden moves. Just quiet grace. He walked to the back and opened the trunk with a key that had seen better decades. Inside was nothing but a bouquet of white lilies wrapped in brown paper, a carefully folded gray fedora, and a small wooden box with the name E. Hale engraved into it. What would you like to inspect? The man asked, his voice steady. I carry nothing illegal. No weapons. No contraband. Only memories. Kyle had no response. Nothing in the trunk was suspicious. But somehow, nothing was ordinary either. And that was the most unsettling truth of all. Kyle Mercer stood still by the open trunk, his badge heavy on his chest, his instincts muted by the quiet elegance of the scene before him. There was no smoke, no rush of adrenaline, no crime unfolding. Just a folded gray fedora, a bouquet of lilies, and a wooden box that seemed to weigh more than its wood and nails could possibly account for. Something in the simplicity of it all began to undo him. Franklin Otis Hale didn't move to justify. He simply stood, one hand resting lightly on the edge of the trunk, the other on his hip, not in defiance but in composure. That subtle difference, a man holding space rather than surrendering to it, was what unsettled Kyle the most. Because it didn't fit. Not the training manuals. Not the behavioral cues. Not the years of reading body language through the lens of suspicion. "You're doing your job," Hale said quietly, not as reassurance, but as acknowledgement. "I understand that. But the badge doesn't give you the right to misread who I am." The words didn't come out sharp. They didn't accuse. But they hit like cold air down a warm spine, chilling, sobering. Kyle's lips parted but no words followed. The normal flow of questions had dried up. He wasn't in charge of this moment anymore. Something about it had slipped away from him, maybe the second Hale opened his mouth, maybe the moment he didn't. He backed away from the trunk as Hale gently closed it. The man didn't slam it, didn't punctuate it. Just sealed it shut like a chapter written long ago, never needing edits. They stood in silence. Hale's presence wasn't forceful, but it held gravity. It was the stillness of someone who didn't need validation to know his worth. Kyle, on the other hand, felt like a man suddenly unsure whether he was enforcing law or imposing his own bias. Then, a soft voice broke the moment. "You need anything else, officer?" Hale asked. Kyle blinked. "No, sir. That'll be all." But it wasn't. He didn't step away. He didn't return to his cruiser. He just stood there, trying to wrap his head around the internal shift he couldn't name. A moment later, a soft voice came from across the street. A woman holding a canvas grocery bag had stopped mid-stride. Her eyes locked on Hale. She didn't speak at first. Just stood there, like she'd seen a ghost wearing skin. Then she called out, barely above a whisper, "Judge Hale." Franklin turned his head ever so slightly and nodded once. A nod not of pride or recognition, but of restraint. She took 2 slow steps back, her hand tightening on the bag, then turned away. Not out of disrespect, but as if she'd intruded on something sacred. Kyle followed her movement with his eyes, something tightening in his chest. "You're a judge?" he asked, voice unsteady. "I was," Hale said, looking back at him. "I sat on the bench for 23 years. Retired 5 years ago. But titles don't matter much once you're back on the street, do they?" That last line wasn't pointed. It was just a fact. But it knocked the breath out of Kyle more than any insult could have. His radio crackled softly in the cruiser. He turned and walked slowly back toward it, but didn't reach for the door. Instead, he leaned against the hood, his arms crossed over his vest, staring at nothing in particular. What had just happened? The man hadn't resisted. Hadn't raised his voice. Hadn't deflected or demanded. And still, Kyle felt as if he'd been confronted with a mirror he'd never asked for. He reached for the radio. "Dispatch, I need confirmation." Was this the Franklin Otis Hale who served on the state Supreme Court? A pause. "Affirmative," came the answer. "State records confirm he's a former associate justice." Cleared multiple tiers of verification. Kyle exhaled slowly. His hand trembled as he set the mic back into its holder. A gust of wind brushed past the cruiser, rattling the nearby dry leaves. The sky had brightened slightly, but the air still held the morning chill. When he looked back, Hale had already returned to the driver's side. He hadn't left. He wasn't fleeing. He was just sitting calm, composed, as if the world hadn't just tried to undo a piece of his identity. Kyle approached again. This time, he didn't ask a question. He just stood there. "I didn't recognize you," he said after a beat. "You weren't expected to," Hale replied, voice measured. "Recognition doesn't protect anyone from being misread." Kyle frowned. "But it should." "That's the problem," Hale said gently. "Too often, the badge gives the assumption that understanding comes after control. That silence means obedience. That calm means guilt. But that's not what law was made for." Kyle looked down at his boots. He'd heard lectures. He'd passed diversity training. He'd nodded along during seminars. But none of that prepared him for this kind of confrontation, the kind that required no shouting, no resistance, just presence. Just dignity. And in that space, Kyle felt smaller than he ever had. He cleared his throat again. "Do you need an escort to your destination?" Hale's lips curved slightly, not a smile, not mockery. Just recognition of the gesture. "No need," he said. "The road I walk wasn't made for those who need escorting." That line hung in the air like a soft sentence in a courtroom, lighter than breath, heavier than guilt. Kyle nodded, stepping back as Hale rolled up the window. The Lincoln started with a smooth hum and pulled away, not in haste, not in pride. Just moving forward, as it always had. Kyle watched it disappear down the road, swallowed by the horizon and flanked by buildings whose bricks had absorbed decades of unspoken truths. He stood alone. The badge on his chest had never felt heavier. Not from weight, but from what it failed to protect against misjudgment. Misuse. Misinterpretation. Back in his cruiser, he didn't turn the ignition. He didn't report in. He just sat, replaying every word, every movement, every still glance that Hale had offered. The man had carried no weapon. No threat. Just a bouquet. A box. A past that deserved better than a roadside assumption. His hand rested on the steering wheel, thumb brushing the edge of the badge sewn into his uniform sleeve. He didn't know what to write in the report. No infraction. No action. No justification. Just a stop that shouldn't have been a stop at all. And yet it was. It always was, for someone who didn't look like the picture in the training manual. Someone whose calmness got mistaken for concealment. Someone whose existence demanded an explanation simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong moment, in a country that claimed to have moved on but still hadn't moved far enough. Kyle glanced into the rearview mirror, not looking at traffic, but at himself. He didn't like what he saw. Not because of guilt. But because of the absence of anything he could call honorable in that reflection. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like an officer. He felt like a man wearing a uniform that didn't shield him from the consequences of his ignorance. And across town, in a quiet little diner, a man with graying hair and a stiff back stirred his coffee slowly. He'd seen the news pop up already. The name Hale had caught his attention like a thunderclap. He didn't need to read the rest. He reached for his coat, dropped a few dollars on the counter, and told the server, "I need to go see someone." The server blinked. "You know him?" The man nodded. "He once pardoned my son. Saw something in him no one else did." The Lincoln's tail lights faded behind a ridge of brick buildings, but the feeling it left in the air stayed behind like the echo of a truth too old to be forgotten. Kyle Mercer sat motionless in his cruiser, his hand still hovering near the ignition as if turning the key would erase the last half hour. He stared at the street ahead, but what filled his mind wasn't the road, it was the weight of a glance, the resonance of words that weren't loud but made everything else feel deafeningly false. Behind him, the radio crackled to life. "Unit 14, confirm status." Kyle didn't respond. "Unit 14, do you require assistance?" Still nothing. Instead, he opened the cruiser door, stepped out slowly, and looked up at the morning sun. It was brighter now. Too bright. Like it was trying to illuminate things not meant to stay in the dark any longer. He reached into his pocket, pulled out Hale's government ID, and turned it over again. The edges were worn, smoothed by time and use, not by deceit. The silver seal was partially faded, but it still caught the light barely, like a voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. Franklin Otis Hale, Kyle whispered to himself. He didn't need to say it louder. The name had already carved itself into his memory like a verdict. Not a guilty one. Not even a righteous one. Just, final. He returned to the cruiser and turned the key. The engine came alive, but he didn't put the car in gear. Instead, he tapped into the onboard computer, searched for the state's legal registry, and typed in the name. Dozens of results popped up. Hale's name was woven into the backbone of the state's legal structure: court opinions, civil rights cases, minority protections, wrongful convictions overturned, school desegregation precedents. Every entry read like a line from a constitutional prayer whispered into courtrooms across the South for the last 30 years. And Kyle had pulled him over for driving a Lincoln too smoothly. He leaned back, breath catching in his chest. It wasn't shame that hit first. It was the brutal clarity of having no excuse to hide behind. Not even ignorance felt like a shield anymore. Across town, word was spreading. A high school civics teacher named Lydia Hark saw the first post on her feed during her prep period. It was a grainy photo someone had snapped Hale from across the road, standing by his car, trunk open, the white lilies in clear view. The caption didn't say much. It didn't have to. Stopped in his own town. No offense committed. No apology offered. By the time the lunch bell rang, the photo had already been reshared over 10,000 times. At the county courthouse, a clerk named Denise walked past the break room, paused at the vending machine, and overheard a conversation between two junior prosecutors. "You really think it was him?" one asked. "He signed the review on the 2006 juvenile justice reform. If you ever passed by the lobby plaque, his name's on it. He's the reason I even wanted to do this job." Denise didn't interrupt. She just bought her coffee and left. But when she reached her desk, she opened a blank email and typed, "To whom it may concern. If it turns out Judge Hale was mistreated, I want it known, I knew who he was. And I should have done more to ensure our officers knew too." She didn't send it. Just saved it. But saving it was enough for now. Enough to say, "I saw this. I won't look away." Meanwhile, in a modest home near the town's edge, a retired veteran named Arthur Bell sat in his recliner, soup untouched on the tray before him. He hadn't turned on the news in weeks. But when his grandson barged in, tablet in hand, breath short from running, Arthur knew it wasn't a normal visit. "Pop," the boy said, "look." He handed him the screen. Arthur squinted. Then froze. "I know him," he said quietly. "He was the man who signed my brother's clemency petition. Told the court a life shouldn't be defined by one bad year." The boy sat down beside him. They stopped him like he was no one. Arthur said nothing. Then got up slowly and walked to his closet. He pulled out his old army jacket, pinned with faded ribbons and a brass nameplate. Then he returned to the living room, slipped it on, and muttered, "I think I need to go shake his hand again." Back at the precinct, Kyle's phone vibrated. It was a message from Lieutenant Sandra Pierce. "Report says you stopped Franklin Hale. Is that accurate?" He didn't reply. 10 seconds later, another message came in. "No write-up yet. Don't move. I'm coming down there." Kyle closed his eyes, leaned forward, and braced himself. This wasn't just a traffic stop anymore. It was a crack in something much larger, something that had long been under pressure but had finally let air escape. When Sandra arrived, she didn't say a word. She just opened the passenger door, slid in, and waited. Kyle handed her the ID. She examined it for a full minute. Then placed it gently on the dashboard and exhaled. I used to see him from the gallery. He never looked like a man who needed to raise his voice. He just made the room quieter by being in it. Kyle didn't speak. You know what this means, right? She continued. There's already chatter. Social feeds, press interest. This isn't a report. This is about what it says when someone like you, someone we trained, can't recognize the very people who helped shape the law we're supposed to enforce. I didn't mean to. Doesn't matter. She looked him dead in the eye. If we don't know who we're protecting, then we've already failed. She got out and walked back toward her own cruiser. Left him with that. Not a reprimand. Not a warning. Just a statement that wouldn't stop echoing. That night, a college student from Elmswood, now attending a journalism program upstate, posted a short video. It was just narration over a photo montage of Judge Hale's early courtroom sketches, his law school diploma, and the famous 1993 case where he ordered the reopening of a wrongfully closed school for black students. The last frame? A still of Hale's Lincoln, parked on the roadside, trunk open, white flowers trembling in the wind. The caption? He wrote the laws that protect us. Then got pulled over for fitting someone's idea of what guilt looks like. The video hit 200,000 views in 4 hours. And in a courthouse hallway the next morning, a junior bailiff, not more than 21 years old, hung a new print beside the display of judges' portraits. It wasn't framed. It wasn't even fancy. Just a black and white still of Judge Hale with a simple line underneath. Dignity doesn't ask to be recognized. It just waits for you to stop pretending you didn't see it. Kyle didn't sleep that night. He tried. He lay on his couch, the sound of the Lincoln's engine replaying in his head, the softness of Hale's voice haunting the corners of his thoughts. When morning came, he didn't put on the uniform. Instead, he drove. Not to the precinct. Not to a new assignment. But to the cemetery just outside of town. He parked and walked the gravel path until he found the gravestone, Eleanor Hale, 1948 to 2012. The bouquet of white lilies lay freshly placed at the base. The fedora beside it. And Judge Hale, seated on the bench nearby, silent, back straight, eyes distant. Kyle didn't speak at first. Just sat beside him. I didn't know who you were, he finally said. I know, Hale replied. I judged you. Yes. A pause. I thought I was doing my job. You were doing your version of it. Kyle swallowed hard. How do you live with that kind of silence? That kind of misunderstanding? Hale didn't answer immediately. Then, you don't live with it. You learn to carry it differently. Kyle looked at him. I can't carry it like you. Hale gave a small nod. Then maybe you carry it loud. So others don't forget why it mattered. They sat there, side by side, two men from different worlds, bound by a moment neither of them had asked for but both would be remembered by. The sun rose higher. And far beyond that quiet bench, the name Franklin Otis Hale began to mean something new to people who had never once read a court opinion because now, it wasn't just about law. It was about how justice feels when it's ignored. The bench was still warm from the morning sun when Kyle Mercer stood up and walked away from Judge Hale's side. He didn't say goodbye. There was no handshake. No dramatic ending. Just a quiet walk back to his cruiser, as if the road he now had to take wasn't paved with apologies, but understanding. And perhaps more importantly, responsibility. Responsibility for every time he'd spoken with certainty instead of curiosity. For every moment he'd treated silence as compliance. And for every stop he made, not because of a violation, but because something about the person didn't feel right. But now, he understood what didn't feel right was never about the person. It was about him. When he reached his car, he didn't start it. He sat inside and opened his notebook, not the one from the department, but a personal one, half-used. And for the first time in years, he wrote down something that wasn't protocol. I saw a man today who reminded me what justice looks like. It doesn't raise its voice. It doesn't argue. It just waits for the world to stop misreading its silence. Across town, the pressure continued to build. The incident had now reached regional news. Local stations scrambled for sound bites. But they had no dramatic footage. No shouting. No bodycam scandal. Just still images, shared stories, and a video of Judge Hale placing lilies on a grave, then stepping back into his car. That, somehow, was worse. Because it was undeniable. And in the absence of noise, people began to listen. At Monroe High School, the civics teacher Ms. Hark walked into her classroom that morning and didn't start the lesson. Instead, she wrote one sentence on the board. Who is allowed to be treated like they belong? Silence. Then, slowly, one student raised his hand. Is this about Judge Hale? Ms. Hark didn't answer. She just nodded. Another student chimed in, he lives 3 blocks from me. My dad says he changed our town. But I never even knew he lived here. That was the point, wasn't it? How does a town forget the face of its conscience? The discussion unfolded like a quiet storm, no shouting, no interruptions. Just a wave of reflection rolling through a room full of teenagers who, up until yesterday, thought the law was something far away. Abstract. Unbending. But now it had a face. And a moment. And a silence so sharp it could slice through every, I didn't know. At the Monroe Police Department, the atmosphere was different. Quieter than usual. Not from fear, but from recognition. The kind that settles over a building when people begin to realize something slipped past them and it can't be reversed. Lieutenant Sandra Pierce stood in the operations room, facing her team. No one's getting fired over this, she said. But make no mistake, we're being watched. No one moved. This isn't about protocol violations. It's about what we didn't see. What we didn't learn. What we never asked ourselves. A young officer near the back raised his hand. Are we getting new training? No, Sandra said. We're getting something harder. Perspective. She pointed to the screen behind her, where Judge Hale's name appeared next to a bullet list of decisions he'd written. Not court jargon, just titles. Denied state disenfranchisement petition, 2007. Restored voting rights for 2,318 citizens, 2010. Reparations for unlawfully confiscated land, 2012. Sandra turned back to her team. This isn't just a name. It's a foundation. And somehow, we pulled it over for driving slow. No one spoke. Because what could they say? That's what made it all so unbearable. Meanwhile, a video surfaced online, not dramatic or damning. Just a girl, no older than 14, sitting at her kitchen table, reading aloud a paragraph she had written for class. My grandfather told me that Judge Hale once helped him keep our house when the state tried to take it. He said the judge didn't even smile. He just signed the order and said, this home isn't yours because you proved it. It's yours because no one should have the power to take it unjustly. The girl's voice cracked near the end. Now people are wondering who he is. But some of us already knew. We just didn't think you'd forget. The video spread across community groups, parenting forums, legal associations. Not because it was loud. But because it was honest. And it left no room for excuses. At a cafe downtown, a barista named Elise, who had once served Judge Hale black coffee with a touch of cinnamon every Wednesday, added a note to the tip jar. You never needed to tell us who you were. But we remember now. And we're sorry it took so long. Customers began dropping handwritten messages into the jar. Some were apologies. Some were just names. One simply read. I was the kid you waved at on my way to school. I thought you were just someone's granddad. Turns out you were everyone's. That afternoon, Kyle sat in the break room, uniform off. He had just submitted a voluntary reassignment request. He didn't want to patrol anymore. He wanted to learn. He wanted to help fix what had gone unseen for too long. Sandra found him sitting there, eyes glazed from lack of sleep, hands wrapped around a paper coffee cup. "You okay?" she asked. "No." She nodded. "That's good." Kyle looked up. Confused. "It means you're not numb," she said. "It means this hit you where it needed to." "I didn't even raise my voice," Kyle whispered. "Didn't threaten. Didn't touch him. But I still made him stand in front of my car. Like he owed me his story." Sandra sat down across from him. "You didn't raise your voice. But you forced him to lower his presence. And sometimes that's worse." Kyle's hand trembled slightly. Do you think he'll ever forgive me?" Sandra paused. "I don't think he's looking for that." "What then?" "I think he's waiting to see what you do with what you've learned." Later that week, a law symposium at the University of South Carolina held a last-minute session titled, "Silence and Systemic Memory, The Story of Franklin Otis Hale." The keynote speaker, a professor of legal ethics, opened not with a quote but with a photo. It was Hale, alone, standing beside his Lincoln, holding a bouquet of lilies. She pointed to the screen and said, "This is what unspoken accountability looks like." He didn't demand reform. He didn't shout for recognition. He just stood still until we were forced to ask why. In the back row, a law student wiped her eyes. Not because she was moved but because for the first time, she realized she might enter a courtroom one day and miss someone like him completely, simply because she hadn't trained herself to look for quiet power. By the end of the week, the department quietly adopted a new guideline. Before issuing any citation or conducting any search, officers were required to ask one additional question on their form: does this individual feel they were treated as if they belonged? No legal weight. No disciplinary tie-in, but it changed everything. Because suddenly, the badge wasn't the last word in the interaction, it was the first test of conscience. And in a room full of uniforms, people began to understand that maybe justice wasn't about enforcement first. Maybe it was about memory. About knowing the names of those who made the law humane and making sure their legacy wasn't erased by routine. Back at the cemetery, Judge Hale stood once more at his wife's grave. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of students, diverse, curious, maybe even a little nervous, stood at a respectful distance. They didn't ask him to speak. They just watched him lay down a single white lily. Then he turned, looked at them, and said, "When silence becomes your only defense, make sure it still says something." He stepped into his Lincoln. Rolled the window down just a crack. And added one more thing: don't fight to be heard. Fight to make sure no one else needs to scream to be seen. The car pulled away once again. Still slow. Still steady. But this time, everyone was watching. Not because he demanded it. But because he didn't. The Lincoln disappeared into the horizon like a thread being pulled from the edge of a worn suit, quiet and unassuming, yet unraveling something bigger behind it. No sirens. No headlines. Just memory in motion. Back at the Monroe precinct, the silence wasn't just a lack of noise, it was a vacuum created by the absence of certainty. Kyle Mercer sat at his desk, no paperwork in front of him, no calls to take, just the echo of his own thoughts bouncing back louder than any dispatcher's voice. A memo had gone out that morning, effective immediately. All officers were required to complete a 2-week rotation through the Community Reflection Program, a local initiative that up until now, no one had taken seriously. It involved listening sessions, civilian-led roundtables, storytelling, empathy training. It had been dismissed as soft protocol. Now, it was the only thing that made sense. Kyle didn't argue. He signed up for the first slot. Across the city, a small exhibit quietly opened inside the Monroe Public Library. It wasn't curated by a museum or funded by any institution. It was organized by a high school literature class. The title? The Man Who Sat Still. The exhibit featured printed tweets, handwritten thank you letters, news clippings, and a silent video loop of Judge Franklin Otis Hale stepping out of his Lincoln, placing a flower on a grave, and driving off. Visitors didn't talk much inside. They didn't need to. There was one piece of paper mounted on the wall, written in a child's handwriting, that captured the mood best. He didn't ask to be famous. He just didn't want to be forgotten. Word of the exhibit spread. Law students came. Veterans came. Even Sandra Pierce showed up one evening after hours, walking the hall alone, reading every letter. She paused longest at the one with the question, would you pull him over again if you didn't know his name? She didn't answer it. Just stood there, letting the question wrap around her badge like a quiet verdict. Meanwhile, back at Judge Hale's modest home, there were no crowds, no media vans, no reporters camped on his lawn. That was intentional. His silence wasn't a refusal. It was a boundary. One that made others confront their impulse to demand from those who have already given enough. He still went for his walks each morning. Still passed the same gas station, nodded at the same mailman, waved to the same child waiting for the bus. But now, every nod returned was a little deeper. Every glance held a little longer. Not because people pitied him, but because they recognized the quiet weight he carried. In the background, Monroe changed slowly. The town council passed a new ordinance requiring bias response training not only for law enforcement but for all public servants. The mayor resisted at first, citing budget issues. But after receiving over 1,000 handwritten postcards, many from students, he changed his vote. Not out of pressure, but out of something deeper. Conscience. One afternoon, Kyle received a plain envelope on his desk. No name. No return address. Inside was a folded slip of paper. It read, sometimes the job is knowing when to stop pulling people over. Sometimes the real work begins after the stop. Kyle folded the paper carefully and placed it in his wallet. Not as a keepsake, but as a reminder. That day, instead of taking the cruiser out for rounds, he walked. Block after block, through streets he used to drive past with suspicion. He made eye contact. He asked names. He introduced himself. Not as Officer Mercer. Just Kyle. And for the first time, people didn't flinch. They spoke. They listened. Because now, they weren't being watched. They were being heard. That evening, Kyle sat outside the same diner where he used to get coffee on his break. The owner, a sharp-eyed woman in her 60s named June, stepped out and sat beside him. No small talk. Just a long breath and then, you know what he did for my sister. Kyle turned. June didn't wait. She was 17. Stuck in a bad case. System stacked against her. He ruled in her favor when no one else would. Said she deserved the chance to prove her life wasn't over. That ruling changed our whole family. Kyle looked down. I didn't know. That's the problem, she said softly. None of you did. Back at the house, Judge Hale sat at his desk, writing a letter not to the public, not to the mayor, not to any court. Just to a young girl in a nearby town who had sent him a crayon drawing of a courthouse with a single line, I want to be a judge too. He didn't give her advice. He didn't quote law. He just wrote, be still when they expect you to break. That's where justice begins. At the same moment, a classroom 2 states over was discussing ethics in government service. The teacher paused the discussion and played the now famous silent clip of Hale standing by his Lincoln. What do you see? He asked. A student replied, I see someone not surprised it happened. Another added, I see someone who's waited a long time for the rest of us to catch up. The teacher nodded. Then erased the board and wrote only one question, How do you honor a man who doesn't want your honor? In the hallway, students talked not about points or extra credit, but about presence. Dignity. Why silence sometimes speaks louder than the truth screamed from podiums. And quietly, the story of Franklin Otis Hale never demanded, never advertised became required reading. Not by law, but by conscience. In the weeks that followed, Kyle began to show up to the community center, not in uniform, but in a t-shirt and jeans. He listened. Sometimes he spoke. But mostly he listened. Because he knew now listening is how healing starts. And Judge Hale? He remained quiet. Not out of protest. But because some men carry their legacy not in books or titles but in the space their silence creates for others to speak. One evening, Kyle saw him again. Same bench. Same stillness. He walked over, unsure what to say. Hale looked up. You found your voice yet? Kyle nodded. Not all of it. But I know now it was never about what I said. It was about how I listened. Hale gave a faint smile. Then that's a start. They sat together. Two men. One road. And between them, a silence that no longer divided but connected. Because justice, in its purest form, is not the echo of power. It's the absence of fear. And that night, as the sun dipped behind the trees, Monroe finally felt like a town ready to listen. This story was never just about a traffic stop. It was about a mirror held up not to one officer, but to an entire system that had grown used to moving forward without ever looking inward. It showed how prejudice doesn't always shout. Sometimes, it whispers through procedure, hides behind instinct, and thrives in the silence of those who choose not to ask, why? Franklin O. Hale didn't protest. He didn't raise his voice. He stood. Calm. Composed. And in that stillness, he asked the most powerful question of all, if someone like him can be doubted, then what is justice really built on? The true legacy of this story is this: dignity is not defined by a title but by how a person carries themselves when stripped of it. Justice doesn't begin in the courtroom, it begins the moment we choose to truly see one another. And silence? Sometimes, silence isn't compliance. Sometimes, it's the only force powerful enough to make a nation stop and listen.